A theme in books and movies that has always intrigued me is the idea of time travel. Some of you are old enough or movie buffs enough to remember movies like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, in which two less than academically stellar high school students, at the behest of George Carlin, travel back in time in a time booth to retrieve great figures of history from the past, Socrates and Abraham Lincoln and Genghis the Khan, Mr. Khan, and they bring them back for a most excellent history presentation, dude. Some of you may remember the Back to the Future franchise, where Marty McFly travels back to the 1950s in a DeLorean so that he can change the future for his family. And then, of course, in very creative Hollywood fashion, there was Back to the Future 2, in which he then travels all the way forward into 2015. And also there's time travel. Or a couple of years ago, the final installment of the Indiana Jones franchise was Indiana Jones on the Dial of Destiny. And he pairs with his estranged daughter to stop a NASA scientist, Dr. Jürgen Voller, from changing the outcome of World War II. And one of the themes that seems to flow along with time travel movies is that the time travel sometimes cannot change the trajectory of history. Sometimes you and I wish we could see the future. And I believe God in his mercy refuses to show us the future. Because if we saw the future and we didn't like what we saw, our struggle would be to try to make changes in the present to adjust that. In other words, to try to play God with our lives. And if we saw the future and we liked what we saw, our struggle would be to try to hurry it up. Daniel was given a vision of the future in Daniel 8, and he didn't need a phone booth or a DeLorean to see it. And I want you to turn to Daniel chapter 8. We're going to spend our time there today. Daniel saw a vision. It was stunning. It was frightening. And in the end, it left him exhausted and helpless. He saw things he could do nothing about. I believe the book of Daniel was compiled in the 6th century BC, and in chapters 7 and 8, he is shown specifically things are going to happen in the 2nd century BC, some 400 years down the road. And seeing that is as much of a burden as it is a blessing when you have that kind of a revelation and you can do nothing about it. In our chapter today, we're going to get a little more clarity. Last week in chapter 7, things were kind of hazy, like a dream usually is. But this is a vision. We'll talk about that in a minute. And we're going to see a little more clarity in what is going to happen, or what Daniel was told was going to happen. But our challenge is not just to go back there. Our challenge this morning is to say, what can I learn from God today, some 2,600 years later? And in that, our theme for this study stands even stronger than ever in the middle of what we don't understand. And that theme is, you're almost probably to the point you can rehearse it with me, no matter the prevailing circumstances in my world, God is always in control, and one day he will make all things new. So in chapter 7, Daniel was sleeping and he had a dream. But in chapter 8, he says, in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after that one that had already appeared to me. He uses a different word. He had a vision. So apparently in that vision, he was awake. It was kind of like he began to maybe be in a trance, but he was awake. And it seems he was transported to a city called Susa. Now, in the Babylonian era, Susa was not of much consequence. But in years to come, Susa would be one of the seats of Persian power. It would be where the kings would have their winter palace and all. And so it was very important. And in fact, if you'll recall the book of Nehemiah, which takes place about 100 years after Daniel, Nehemiah is in the palace, in the citadel at Susa. Susa would become a major city for the Persian rulers. And I think one of the things that we can learn from this vision is God is showing Daniel that the power is one day going to move from Babylon, out of Babylon, to Susa. Babylon will eventually lose its influence. And as we had talked about last week, I believe it was these two chapters and these two visions that helped inform Daniel when he read the handwriting on the wall and said to Belshazzar, "Your kingdom is done. It's over." So here's the vision. Daniel is sitting there. He's by the canal. He looks up and he sees a ram. He sees a ram with two horns, but one horn is larger than the other. And he says, eventually they even out in size. And he says, this ram overcomes all the other animals on the earth to the north and the west and the south. Now you'll say, why isn't the east mentioned? Well, we'll see in a minute, spoiler alert, that the ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire. They came out of the east toward the west, north, and south. So that would be the reason there. And it said this ram was unbeatable. It says in verse 4, it did as it pleased and became great. And so here's this ram doing everything it wants to do in this vision. And as Daniel is thinking about this, suddenly a unicorn goat comes out. It says there, verse 5, I'm thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes. So it's a unicorn goat. And it comes out, and it's not just kind of trotting along. It looks like it's not even touching the ground. It is coming with speed and with force. And it comes with speed and force, and it literally obliterates the ram and tramples it. I saw it attack the ram, verse 7, furiously, striking the ram, shattering its two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Sound familiar? And he says out of one of the horns came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east toward the beautiful land. Very interesting. So this horn, this big horn is crushed. 4 horns grow up. Out of one of them grows a little horn, and it focuses on the beautiful land. Now you say, what's the beautiful land? Well, that is a phrase that is very important. We see that phrase from a contemporary of Daniel, a prophet by the name of Ezekiel. And in Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 6 and again in verse 15, he refers to the land of promise as a land flowing with milk and honey, the most beautiful of all lands. So when you look at that phrase, you realize that was what was told to Moses. Take the people to a land that is flowing with milk and honey. So now the focus of this vision is the land of Israel. The horn, the little horn, in essence, deifies itself. We have a summary of it here, picking up in verse 11. Oh, I'll pick it up in verse 10. It grew. We're talking now about the horn that grew out of the other one. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down because of the rebellion of the Lord. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. So this horn, in essence, deifies itself. In the vision, this horn attacks the starry host, which would be kind of a euphemism for the angels. And shocking to me, probably very shocking to Daniel, it has some success against the celestial army. And it envisions itself as being great as the commander of the army of the Lord. The commander of the army of the Lord is the Lord himself. So it's deifying itself. And it eventually takes away the daily sacrifice. And the horn prospers. And truth suffers. And Daniel hears some voices, two celestial beings talking to one another. And they ask the question, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? And one of them says, it will take 2,300 evenings, 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. Now Daniel is sitting there trying to figure all this out. What does this mean? And as he's trying to figure it out and watching the vision, trying to understand it, he sees one before him that looks like a man. And then he hears another voice, a voice coming from the canal. And it's calling. It says, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. And as he, I believe it's Gabriel, came near where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. He is in the presence of this amazing, mighty angel, and he drops to the ground. And he says to him, Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. And while he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. So he's down. He's like totally out of it. The angel raises him up. And he says, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. And so he gives him some specifics. We don't have to guess because it's given to us. The two-horned ram represents the kings of Media and Persia. The Medes were initially the stronger of the two groups. They joined with the Persians, but eventually Persia grew in power. So there was the big horn and the small horn on the ram, but eventually they grew in size. And the Persians would increase in time. There were those these were the ones who defeated Babylon. Nobody thought Babylon was too big to fail, so to speak, and said, here come the Medes and the Persians, and they defeat Babylon. But then there's the goat coming out of the west. The goat coming out of the west is the shaggy goat is the king of Greece. Alexander the Great was 20 years old when he started his conquest of the known world. And he completed that conquest when he was 33. 13 years. The armies of Greece were unstoppable. Therefore, the swift goat that just took over everything. And Alexander died. The Greek Empire started from Athens and went all the way to India and was as far north as the Black Sea and down all the way into Egypt. And Israel was caught up in that. So it was amazing. Upon his death, as we spoke last week, the empire was divided into 4 sections, 4 generals, 4 horns, starting to make sense. And those generals, that was not like an easy division. It was not like, you take this one out. No, there was a lot of strife and chaos. And we're told in the latter part of the reign, the kingdoms would not have the same power as he did. And then, verse 23, in the latter part of their reign, when the rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. A fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue. The message says a trickster, someone who cannot be trusted. And we believe through history and through understanding this was the man that we talked about last week, Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. He came to the throne roughly 175 BC. And he worked to set himself up in his region, a region that included Egypt and Israel and some of those areas, he worked to set himself up as somebody to be noticed and somebody to be feared. People were told, Jews as well as others, you only worship Zeus or you die. And in fact, in 170 BC, there was a high priest in Israel. His name was Onias III, and he was assassinated. And, plausible deniability has been around for centuries upon centuries. It had all the fingerprints of Antiochus Epiphanes on it, that death, but he didn't personally take charge. He was at a party. I don't know. And Antiochus turned his hostility toward the beautiful land for a variety of reasons. We'll look at what it says, the summary, and then I'll tell you that. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will succeed in everything he does. He will cause deceit to prosper. He will consider himself superior. And when they feel secure, he will destroy many and will take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. So Antiochus, in about 170 or 68, and a little bit before that, some things happened. First of all, he turned his attention to the beautiful land because he had inherited a lot of debt. So he thought if he could turn the temple worship into something from which he could prosper, that would help his debt. So temple worship starts getting eliminated because we need to use it for Zeus, because then you bring offerings to Zeus and those become mine. But there was also some tension in the land of the Jews. There was one faction that said, you know what? Let's go along to get along. Why don't we just adopt Hellenistic philosophy and Hellenistic culture, and let's go ahead and just be like the Greeks. It's going to go a lot easier for us if we do that. But there was another group that said, time out. Don't you know what the text says? We are not so long ago, our people were captive in Babylon, and we just don't want to go back there. And so he, as the master of intrigue, as a trickster, was able to curry favor with the Hellenistic-minded Jews, and he found ways to persecute those who would not submit. In 168 BC, his armies were humiliated by Egypt. They had become aligned with a new upstart group coming up in the world called Rome. And he was humiliated. And a weak leader who's humiliated will always look to find a way to build his ego at the cost of somebody else. And he turns all his anger toward defeating Jerusalem. And that began with what we looked at last week when he went into the temple and he had a statue of Zeus erected, and he sacrificed the animal that Zeus required as a sacrifice. He sacrificed a pig on the altar of God, which was an unclean animal according to the Mosaic law, which was as offensive as you could get. And that led to what we talked about last week, the revolt of the Maccabees. He took his stand against God, and it would cost him. Now, Daniel sees all of this, and then he's told, seal it up. That's it. You're done. It deals with the future. Seal it up. So what do we get out of this? What can we possibly learn? Well, first, let me talk about numbers. And we're going to see some numbers here today. We'll see some numbers tomorrow. That feels like that to me sometimes. I only work on Sunday. So it feels like numbers next week. But they say, how long? That is the cry of everyone who suffers. How long, Lord? And so they say 2,300 mornings and evenings. Well, what does that mean? Well, you could look at it from a couple of different standpoints. If you look at it from the story of creation, the story of creation says there was morning and evening the first day, morning and evening the second day. So you would say, oh, well, that's 2,300 days, or roughly 6 years. It was roughly 6 years from the assassination of Onias in 170 to the restoration and rededication of the temple in 164. So that could work. Or you could say, well, you had the morning sacrifice and the evening sacrifice. And so now you have 1,150 days. I used a calculator. You have 1,150 days, and so that's roughly 3 years, and that could cover the time between the desecration of the temple and the restoration of the temple. What do we do with all these numbers? Well, I appreciate deeply the comment of one Old Testament scholar, and his summary really helped me. He said this: the highly symbolic numbers in Daniel are not for date setting, but they're for comfort. They remind us that God knows what he's doing and has set a limit on how long the present evil world will oppress us. That makes so much sense, because we can all caught up, are we in the 70th week of Daniel? Are we not? That's next week. What are the 2,300 days? What's time, half a time? Just breathe. God says all of this is temporary. And the heart of our theme really stands out here, and it's simply this. The first takeaway point, if you will, for today: God is always in control. Don't ever lose sight of that reality. God is always in control. He's not up there in heaven going, what? I don't know what to do anymore. He's in complete control. He's got this. From all accounts, Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, was a vicious and awful man. And he appeared to be successful for a time, until you get to that last phrase in Daniel chapter 8, verse 25, yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. It's important for you and me to believe every day that God is in control. And I know, we all know, we've all been there. Life can come at you hard. It can come at you fast. And believe me, things seem to happen in spurts. It's like this goes wrong, and that goes wrong, and that goes wrong. It's like, is it ever going to stop? And there are times when we don't feel like we have a clue. Times when it just seems like we're losing our mind. And in those moments, even though it's hard, I think it's important to take a moment to step back, to try to breathe, and just simply say, God is in control. I can't tell you how many times when Charlene and I have been talking about things going on in our lives or lives of others and all, and it just feels so confusing. And one of us will say to the other, but the Lord knows. And that's not just a cliche. We truly believe that. And we've seen God time and time again work things out. And yet, I would say, while God is in control, while nothing you and I face has escaped his notice, sometimes on this side of heaven, things will go bad and they may not get better. Sometimes, even for followers of Jesus, it does not always turn out well in the end on earth. Good and godly people throughout history and even in our own world today are persecuted and mistreated and falsely accused, and sometimes offered protection only to have it ripped away, and even martyred for their faith. And you and I, like the angel in Daniel 8:13, you and I, like the martyrs around the throne in Revelation 6:10, we cry out with them, how long, O Lord? And what I learned from Daniel 8 is that when God says it is time for evil to end, evil will end. And he is in control, regardless how it looks right now. God is here. God is there for you. God is involved. And his patience with the sin of this world will one day run out. But for now, he's patient, as 2 Peter says, because he's not desirous, he's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. He wants people to turn and come to him, and he's giving chance after chance after chance. I read a statement from a theologian from Thailand. His name is Satanam Bunyakat, and I probably messed that up. I'm sorry, sir. He says this. He says one of the most difficult faith responses for any of us is to simply believe God is still God when life falls apart. If I really believe God is in control, if I really believe that he is going to one day make all things new, then in the moment I need to truly choose to believe God is still God when life falls apart. Part of our faith walk is that. And another part of our faith walk is this. We need to believe that evil has a shelf life. Evil has a divine shelf life. God did not create evil, but he allowed for evil to exist when he created you and me with the ability to freely choose. As a result, evil is a temporary reality. And we have to remember we are finite, we are time dependent. But we serve a God who is infinite, who is above time, who is not bound by time, who doesn't see time limits the same way we do. And we trust him to know when the time for evil to end is. And we have evidence in Scripture that tells us it will be abrupt. In Genesis chapter 6, it got so bad that God decided to wipe out the known world and destroyed it with a flood. And it came like that when they were living and eating and drinking and giving in marriage and being married and just living their lives. There's a story in Genesis 38 that just always makes me scratch my head. Judah had a son. His son's name was And the Bible tells us in Genesis 38:6 that he was so wicked that God literally just took his life. And I just sit there and go, how there are bad people in this world. You and I know of bad people. We've read of bad people. How bad do you have to get for God to say, you're done? It came quickly. And in Genesis 8:25, the little horn is destroyed. Evil will not last forever, and it is judged permanently by God. God has given all humanity the freedom to choose, and in so doing, we have the freedom to choose to follow him or to choose to reject him. But all humanity needs to know that evil has a divine shelf life, and God will hold each one accountable. So that's great, Pastor Scott. What do we do? Look at the last verse in Daniel chapter 8. I, Daniel, was worn out. You can imagine, right? I lay exhausted for several days. I mean, he's just dead. I can't even deal with this. And I love this sentence. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. In the final analysis, Daniel wrote down what he saw, took some time to process it, obeyed, sealed it up, and then he went about the king's business. What an example for us. I would say this: stay in the present and let God manage the future. Stay in the present and let God manage the future. I have often been asked, so Pastor, do you think we're in the end times? And my answer for quite a few years has been the same. We have been in the end times, in the last days, whatever phrase you want to use, since the day Jesus ascended in the clouds in Acts chapter 1. We have been in the last days. Every New Testament writer expected Jesus to come back at any moment. They weren't saying, oh, wait, this isn't fulfilled. Nope, they were concerned it was all fulfilled. and he would come back. And you know what? Jesus gave us some clues about the last days. In Matthew 24, 3 through 14, he says, many are going to come and they're going to claim to be the Messiah and claim to be a deliverer. And he said, you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars, and nation will rise against nation. And he said there's going to be famines and earthquakes in places, and persecution's going to happen. People are going to turn away from their faith, and false prophets and teachers will come. And then John in 1 John 2 says, and many antichrists will come. And you can take that list, and you can go any era in the past 2,500 years, and you can lay that list over that era, and you go, oh yeah, there it is. There's nations rising against nations, and there's famines, and there's earthquakes, and there's this, and there's that. Our task is to follow the commands of Jesus, to love God with all of our heart and strength, to love others as ourselves, and to make disciples. That's our job. That's what it means to stay in the present. God's got the rest managed. Don't worry about it. Stay in the present and do what God puts before you to do today, and remain faithful to Jesus no matter what. Now, don't hear me saying, cool, I don't have to plan. I don't have to save. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. Invest, plan, save for retirement, whatever that looks like for you. Save for emergencies. That's important. Budget wisely. All of that's important. Use your time wisely. Use your gifts wisely. But hold all of your plans and everything up to God in an open hand and say, God, these are my plans, but you direct my steps. Here they are. I'm trusting you with the future. Now, oftentimes Daniel is studied right alongside Revelation because John, in many ways, has shown similar visions. But I believe that the theme or the call in both books is that those who are faithful to God in a world that is constantly resistant to God should live, as what one person says, as dissident disciples. What that means is we don't, like the Hellenistic Jews, go along to get along. We know that we reside in this world, but we steadfastly, with grace and discipline and strength, stand against that which is against God, regardless of the human source. And we do that in whatever way God puts before us to do. One final thing, staying in the present means to choose to make a difference for God where we are. Make a difference from God where you are now. Jesus said, if maybe you read the Sermon on the Mount this last week on Friday, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, let your light shine before others so that they may see God. One way we make a difference is being aware of those who are vulnerable around us, being aware of those who are suffering. Suffering is a byproduct of evil. And suffering happens in our world everywhere we look, from our own cities and neighborhoods to places like Ukraine, to the horrors and genocide and starvation in Gaza, to places that don't make the news cycle like South Sudan and Nigeria. You just go anywhere you can think of and you can see suffering and evil in our world. And you may not have, I don't have a platform to eradicate all suffering. That's not maybe my role, but I can stand with those who suffer. I can stand with the vulnerable. I can pray for them. Where I have opportunity, I can use my voice. On the one hand, you have Matthias Maccabee and his son Judas, that they went at it, and they started guerrilla warfare and overtook that. That was what God called them to do. But sometimes it's not just about praying or asking how long. Maybe we can enter into suffering. Maybe we can be salt and light. Maybe we can make a difference. Let me leave you with one example. I read of a couple. They felt called of God to move into a working class immigrant neighborhood in London's East End. He is a photographer, and he called himself a wartime photographer. Not that he was out on the battlefield, but he was in the wars of poverty and all around them. The neighborhood they live in has the highest rate of child starvation in all of London. They're part of a group called Inner Change, and they just wanted to make a difference. And he said he began to use his photography in a different way. He calls it prophetic photography. And instead of taking a picture and showing how bad it is, and that's what he would do for a while, he said, I started taking photos and showing how people still, in the midst of their poverty, in the midst of their struggle, have hopes and dreams. I saw one photo that he took. It was black and white. It was a car covered with snow, and two people were standing. They'd just drawn a heart on the back window. You know, just little ways like that to say we have hope. Because people in their vulnerability and their poverty and their suffering still have hopes and dreams. He expressed his long-term desires this way. Where the world sees poverty, we want it to see a different sort of richness. Where the world sees violence, we want it to see people longing for peace. Where the world sees crime, we want it to see neighbors looking out for each other. Where the world sees brokenness, we want it to see stories of hope and strength. Where the world sees destruction, we want it to see signs of God's redemption. Amidst the darkness, we want the world to see the kingdom. Daniel saw a glimpse into the future, and it left him dazed and stunned and confused. And yet, once he got through that, he got up and went about the king's business. And we look back at Daniel's vision through the lens of history, and we see a God who is in control, a God who, as we said last week, has evil on a leash, a God who calls us to trust him, a God who says, stay in the present, serve where I've placed you, trust me for the future, because he's a God who's never far away. Father, we thank you for your word this morning. We thank you for hope that we can have in a vision that has oftentimes been very confusing to us. And we ask, Lord, that you would help us to be those people who serve in the present, serve in the place where you have placed us. Those people, Lord, who love you with all of our heart, soul, and strength, who truly love our neighbor, every person that crosses our path, with that same kind of love that we already have for ourselves. And that we just be your people to make disciples, to help other people see you. Help us to be salt and light where you've placed us. In Jesus' name, amen.